Often the storms of life seem fierce, don't they? We find ourselves navigating choppy waters relationally or emotionally, or even losing our way altogether. Today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg takes us to a familiar scene in the New Testament where Jesus actually calmed the storm. It's part of our series called Dangers, Toils, and Snares, and Alistair begins today's message by reading from Mark chapter 4, verse 35.
That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Amen. Well, clearly this is a familiar story. Any of us who've been around church at all or have been in Sunday school as children will not have been able to miss this one. We may also have come to the conclusion that the message of this particular little section of Mark's Gospel, it's also elsewhere in the Synoptics, is simply this: Jesus calmed the storm on the lake, and he can calm the storm in your life. And if that is actually all that this passage is teaching, then probably we ought just to say that to ourselves a couple of times, have a song, benediction, and leave. Jesus calmed the storm on the lake, and he can calm the storm in your life. Okay, now let's go home. I think you will have already detected that I'm not so sure that that is actually the message that is conveyed to us in this little section. I'm not sure that that is actually the point of the passage, despite the fact that what I've just said is actually true. That the Lord who calms the storms is the same Lord who is able to calm the storms in our lives. But what is it we're being told here? Well, let's just notice the details, because there are quite a few details. First of all, let's notice that this has to do with the boat again. The boat was introduced back in chapter 3 and verse 9, where Jesus said, because of the crowd, he said to his disciples, "Why don't you get a small boat ready to keep the people from crowding me?" Well, it seemed to be a very sensible idea, and so it was that at the beginning of chapter 4, we're told that Jesus began to teach by the lake, and the crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it on the lake while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. So he had established his own floating pulpit. Now, you will notice that the details are such that this is clearly an eyewitness account. Maybe Peter was the eyewitness, we don't know. Somebody told Mark and gave them the details. So, for example, you will notice that it is noted that it was in the evening that this took place. You will notice also that there were other boats with him. We're also told that the squall was a furious squall. In verse 37, that the waves were actually breaking over the boat, and that this wasn't something that was just a passing issue, but that the boat was in danger of being completely swamped, and therefore those in it. We're then told where Jesus was in the boat. He was in the stern. We're also told what he was doing in the boat. He was sleeping. And we're also given the detail that he was sleeping on a cushion. And that's quite remarkable. And then we're told that the disciples woke him up, and they said to him, "Don't you care if we drown?" He got up, got the thing sorted out, and then he said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And then they were completely freaked out, and they started to say to one another, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Okay, so there are all these details there. The indication of eyewitness account is good for us to think about this, because when we go back out into the community tomorrow, people will want to tell you, well, your Bible is a concoction, just some people made it all up, it's just a big invention, and you really shouldn't pay any attention to it at all. Most of the time, they've never read the Bible themselves. They just read that in a magazine and decided to annoy you with it. Now let me ask you a question as well. As we look at this, why were the disciples out on the lake, and why did they end up in the storm? Well, first of all, notice why they were not there. They were not in the middle of a storm. They were not facing this predicament because they were disobedient, because they had been bad. They were not in the predicament because they had made foolish choices. What we learn here is that it was as a result of their obedience that they found themselves in the eye of the storm. And God is a God who, for his own purposes, leads his people into storms, leads his people into difficulty, leads his people into experiences that make them wonder whether we have any faith at all. Now, we don't want to delay on anything tonight. Indeed, I think that the pace of the record is so good that it would be a real nonsense for me to string it out. So let's just notice that this storm in verse 37 is a furious storm. I'm not going to try and impress you with all my knowledge of the geography of the area, as if somehow or another, on the few occasions that I've been on the Sea of Galilee, I was able to detect all of this information. I've stored it up in my mind and I can produce it at the drop of a hat. Not for a moment. But what had happened here, and what apparently happens on the Sea of Galilee, is similar to clear air turbulence. And this particular lake was capable of something very similar. The geography of the area, the hills, it's a 13-mile long, it's 7.5 miles wide. It sits approximately 650 feet below the Mediterranean Sea. And as a result, when the cool air rushes down, for example, from Mount Hermon and the surrounding mountains and meets the hot air that's coming up off the surface of the lake, then it is recorded both in the Bible and in secular history that the place is famous for these kind of violent storms. And it must have been quite a violent storm for it to have caused those who were familiar with the sea to be as distressed as they were. So what was essentially a routine journey for them, let's go across the lake, there was nothing in that, led to this furious storm and led in turn to their cry for help. The boat was being swamped. They were clearly in great danger. And Jesus, who has apparently fallen asleep, presumably immediately, like my father-in-law when he used to fly, he was asleep before ever anything. He never heard any of the announcements at all. He was long gone. And he just slept blissfully. I admired it greatly. And Jesus must have been doing something similar in the boat. He's been doing all of this talking, everything else. Is there a cushion back here? Yes, we have one in the back there. You can use that. He said, fine, I'll use the cushion. And he laid the cushion down, put his head on it, and before he knew, he was just fast asleep. And so they've got to go and wake him up. You see, what had happened to them was that they had very quickly passed the point of their know-how. In fact, they had found out that their know-how wasn't sufficient for this circumstance. They found that they were in a circumstance where they had lost control. Actually, they never had control, but the notion that they had control has now been completely taken from them. And so they go to Jesus, who is asleep, as Mark records for us on the cushion, and they wake him up. Now, if you have the impression, if I have the impression, and I have to be careful that I don't fall foul of conjecture in this, but for myself, I can't imagine that they just dispatched one, that they had a little committee, and they said, now, who would like to go and wake Jesus up? And eventually one of them was elected. And then he went over to Jesus, and he just ever so slightly just pulled on him a little bit and shook him on the shoulder, and eventually Jesus stirred, and he said, I'm sorry to trouble you, but some of the others are getting very frightened, and I mean I'm cool with it, but I was nominated to come, and maybe you could do something to allay their fears. You don't have to do it now, but sometime in the sometime before we get to the other side, sometime in the foreseeable future, maybe you could do something. No, I don't think it went like that at all. I think it was like, now, Jesus, please, quick, do something. Look at us. It was that kind of encounter, that kind of storm. Not a storybook storm, but a flesh and blood reality that chilled them to the core and caused them to cry out for help to the only one that they thought was possibly able to remedy their circumstances. And they must, as I say to you, have been phenomenally overwhelmed in order to find themselves in this predicament, in this sea. And notice what they ask. This is the worst of all questions. Teacher, didascale, don't you care if we drown? Jesus must have looked up into the eyes of the questioner and thought to himself, hey, I called you into my band, didn't I? I wouldn't have called you if I wasn't going to take care of you. Don't I care? The reason I'm in the boat is because I care. The reason I'm in the world is because I care. The reason that I'm going to go to the cross and die for you guys is because I care. Before we start to stand up in judgment on the disciples, let's just be honest enough to recognize that we know this kind of question. That in the midst of the extremities of life, when the waves break over the bow, as it were, of our vessel, when we feel ourselves in danger of being swamped, we're not always immediately going for verses from the Psalms simply to remind ourselves of truths that we've learned long since. But we may find ourselves like the disciples inquiring, don't you care if we drown? You see, what had happened to these disciples was very straightforward. It can happen to us in an instant, and that was that the storm, which was the immediacy of their circumstances, so filled their minds that it came between them and their assurance of Jesus' care. And it caused them to lose sight or lose sound of Jesus' word. Because Jesus' word had been straightforward. In verse 35, let us go over to the other side. Jesus didn't say, let's go out on the lake and see if we can drown ourselves. Jesus said, no, we're going over to the other side. That was his word. Let's go over to the other side. Now they find themselves in the middle of the deal, and not only do they doubt the assurance of his love for them, but they doubt the reality of his word to them. Isn't that what happens to us? Well, he got up, verse 39, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, quiet and be still. And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Notice again the eye of detail here. It wasn't